Well, it now looks like one American fighter pilot was shot down not once, but twice during combat operations against Iran during Operation Epic Fury. And I can't decide if this is a tale of the world's unluckiest pilot or the luckiest one. According to recent reports, the American F-15E pilot who was shot down over Iran on April 3rd was also among the 3 American pilots who were shot down by a friendly Kuwaiti fighter just over a month earlier. Now, this story was reported first by Highside co-founder and noted defense journalist Sean Naylor, who cites several unnamed current and former Air Force officials as his sources. And normally I might not report on that sort of claim coming from a single journalist citing unnamed sources, but Sean Naylor has spent the better part of 3 decades building his credibility in the defense news space, including with his embedded reporting out of Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Haiti, and the Balkans. In 2015, Naylor's book, Relentless Strike: The Secret History of Joint Special Operations Command, was released, and since then, we've cited its reporting multiple times in our work. And just for some icing on that credibility cake, I have also been told that this report is true by my own sources, who have also asked to remain off the record. But I do want to be clear that so far the Pentagon has not confirmed Naylor's report, so feel free to take this information with a grain or whatever sized helping of salt that you might prefer. But in the meantime, let's dive into what we know, what's been reported, and what we can assume based on the circumstances, environment, and the operational tempo of Operation Epic Fury. Because as near as I can tell, being shot down twice in the same conflict, heck, almost twice in the same calendar month, puts this poor guy in pretty rare company, as one of maybe just 3 pilots to earn this unlucky distinction since World War II. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Ground News helps you stay on top of breaking news from all around the world, while also helping you see right through common forms of media bias and the sensationalism that can be so commonplace online today. Ground News compiles stories from outlets all over the planet and puts them all into one easy-to-read feed that doesn't just help me keep up to date on what's going on, but it also shows me the ways different media outlets cover the same story in very different ways. Like this one, covering reports that Iran may have damaged or destroyed more American military assets in the Middle East than has been officially acknowledged. Ground News has gathered coverage of this story from 50 different news outlets, with just 6 of them listed as being politically centered. And here on the right-hand side of the screen, we can see the bias distribution and factuality ratings for coverage of this story, with 47% of sources covering the story listed as left-leaning, and 68% rated for high factuality. And Ground News also shows you really important stuff about these outlets along with their headlines, like their political bias, their factuality rating, their corporate ownership, or their government affiliations. And I really love the Ground News For You tab that helps me stay on top of the topics that I have chosen as important to me. Ground News is a big part of my research and my day-to-day news reading, and it can be for you too. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's, or just follow the link in the description below to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off their Vantage plan that'll help you stay on top of things. On April 3rd, a U.S. Air Force F-15E Strike Eagle out of the 494th Fighter Squadron, flying under the call sign Dude 44, was shot down over Iran by what reports indicate may well have been an infrared-guided, shoulder-fired missile. In fact, NBC recently reported that the MANPAD, or Man-Portable Air Defense System, employed in this shootdown may have even been supplied to Iran by China. But despite the sort of breathless nature of their reporting, it's pretty important to understand that this is not a capability Iran would have lacked without Chinese support. Manpads, including the FN and QW series systems produced by China, are designed to engage low-flying threats by tracking their heat signatures, with both families of Chinese systems reaching maximum altitudes of only around 13,000 feet and lower, and Iran's own domestically produced Misag series manpads offering similar range and altitude capabilities. Notably, Iran also operates several larger, but still short-range, infrared or electro-optically guided surface-to-air missile systems that serve as even more potent close-range threats. Now, the pilot of that downed Strike Eagle was rescued about 7 hours later, that same day, but the jet's weapons systems officer, who rides in the backseat, was in for a much harder ordeal, ultimately being rescued under cover of darkness by special operators on April 5th. And we actually have a whole video about how that operation played out if you're interested. Now, according to Naylor's sources, that weapons systems officer was actually injured after his ejection because his parachute failed to open fully, making his 2-day ordeal on the run from Iranian forces that much more harrowing. And now, based on these new reports, we've learned that the Strike Eagle pilot had actually already been shot down by friendly fire just about 5 weeks earlier, when a Kuwaiti F-18 Hornet shot down 3 American Strike Eagles in rapid succession while the jets were defending Kuwaiti airspace against inbound Iranian Shahed-style attack drones. And while there have been lots of conspiratorial rumors about how the Kuwaiti fighter managed to make such an egregious mistake, or whether it was even really a mistake at all, it's important to know that there has yet to be any actual evidence that this incident was anything other than just a really bad error. And it's in times like these that I tend to lean into Hanlon's razor, which, in brief, suggests that we never attribute to malice that which we could adequately explain with stupidity. If evidence to the contrary does surface, then we can go ahead and reevaluate that position, but I'll leave it there for now. As for this Strike Eagle pilot, who, according to these reports, was shot down twice in just over a calendar month, well, I'm sure he'll be the target of plenty of friendly ribbing from his fellow aviators, but it is important that we all recognize that as far as the information we have available is concerned, there's really no reason to suspect that either of these incidents was that pilot's fault. The friendly fire incident in March was obviously and objectively the Kuwaiti pilot's fault, regardless of his intentions. Now, based on footage that is alleged to show one of the Strike Eagles falling out of the sky and the circumstances of that engagement, it seems potentially likely to me that the Kuwaiti Hornet hit all 3 Strike Eagles with some variation of the AIM-9 Sidewinder, infrared-guided air-to-air missile. Now, this has not been confirmed by any official sources, but Kuwait is known to have Sidewinders ranging in capability from rather dated AIM-9Ls that first emerged back in the 70s to the most modern and advanced AIM-9X Block 2s, any of which would make for a more cost-effective choice for shooting down drones than the much more expensive radar-guided AMRAAMs that they could also carry. And that may actually speak to how this friendly fire incident could potentially have occurred. At that point in Operation Epic Fury, the Kuwaiti military had reportedly intercepted 394 inbound Shahed-style attack drones, which equates to shooting down more than 65 targets a day, every day, for a week straight. Now, that is a much more hectic combat environment than any Kuwaiti pilot has likely to have ever seen at any point in their career. I mean, Kuwait's Air Force only operates about 40 fighter aircraft, including 27 American-sourced F-18 Hornets and 13 Eurofighter Typhoons, according to the World Directory of Modern Military Aircraft. That all means that there were more attack drones being shot down over Kuwait each day than the nation even has fighters. And to that point, Kuwaiti officials claimed this friendly fire incident occurred shortly after multiple Iranian drones had crossed the border into Kuwaiti airspace, where that Hornet and those Strike Eagles were all operating in relatively close quarters to intercept them. Now, Kuwait's Hornets carry the AN/APX-111 combined interrogator transponder to discriminate between friendly and enemy contacts. We commonly call this an IFF, or Identification Friend or Foe system. Now, this system is integrated to some extent with the fighter's AN/APG-65 pulse Doppler radar. So when the radar array detects a contact, the AN/APX-111 transmits a coded signal directly to that contact. And if it's friendly, the target aircraft's IFF transponder will receive that encrypted signal and then reply with its own for the Hornet to decode and confirm that that aircraft is friendly. But Sidewinder missiles are not radar-guided weapons and carry only passive sensors. That is to say that the Sidewinder can't distinguish between friend or foe, and while the fighter's onboard radar is capable of cueing the Sidewinder onto a target after it's used that IFF to determine if it's friendly or not, basically it can tell the IR sensor where to look, that is not the only way Sidewinders could be employed. You could also use them effectively as point-and-shoot weapons, relying on the missile's onboard infrared seeker alone. That is to say that the Kuwaiti pilot was likely aware of the presence of those Strike Eagles, just as those Strike Eagles were all but certainly aware of the presence of that Hornet. But when targets started closing in from the same basic direction as those friendly fighters, well, that pilot may have failed to recognize the likelihood that his infrared-guided weapons would go after those closer fighters rather than the drones closing from further ahead. Now, this is strictly a hypothetical possibility, but it's certainly not one that's outside the realm of reason. Likewise, while American F-15Es do carry the AN/ALR-56C radar warning receiver that could potentially notify aircrews when they've been locked onto by, say, a Hornet's radar for an AMRAAM shot, the only notice the Strike Eagle crews would have gotten coming from an AIM-9 Sidewinder would have come from their AN/AAR-57 Common Missile Warning System, which could only have detected the infrared spike of that missile's launch and then tracked its trajectory optically toward the fighter. Now, this advanced warning, if you could call it advanced, we're talking about maybe a second or two, combined with the Sidewinder's relatively small 21-pound warhead and where it likely struck these aircraft, well, that could all explain why all 6 crew members of those American Strike Eagles were able to safely eject. And for the record, just getting back into the cockpit that quickly after an ejection is honestly a pretty impressive feat in itself. I mean, the old pilot joke goes that ejection seats save your life by trying to kill you. The F-15E Strike Eagle carries ACES-2, short for Advanced Concept Ejection Seat 2 systems for both the pilot and the Wizzo, who eject at a slightly staggered pace, with the Wizzo going first, followed by the pilot, with a smaller divergence rocket firing to create separation between them. Now, this system, while among the safest ejection seats in the world, does still rely on a 21-pound solid propellant rocket motor that ignites as the seat is catapulted out of the aircraft. Now, that rocket is powerful enough to launch a relatively light pilot 200 feet into the air from a dead stop on the ground, while subjecting the pilot's spine to roughly 12 G's worth of compression forces in the process. Now, the whole event, from sitting in the cockpit and pulling that ejection lever to becoming a human-shaped ballistic missile to finding yourself under a fully deployed parachute, can all take less than 2 seconds, depending on ejection altitude and airspeed. In a real way, this experience is like getting into 3 car accidents in very short order. The first accident is when the missile hits your aircraft, the second is being shot out of the aircraft under rocket power, and the third is hitting the ground, which even under a fully deployed parachute can still be at speeds approaching 20 miles per hour. Now, this process has been known to break limbs and cause compression fractures of vertebrae, with some pilots reporting losing upwards of an inch in height after being forced to punch out, while others, maybe you might call them the lucky ones, managed to escape unscathed and healthy enough to get right back into the fight. And it now appears that that is exactly what the pilot at the center of our story managed to do. As for the shootdown over Iran, one could make the argument that flying low enough to be within man-pad striking distance shouldn't have been necessary for most modern combat aircraft, but we don't actually know the nature of the mission being flown or what circumstances could have prompted intentionally assuming that increased risk. Manpads, in particular, represent a kind of unique problem, not just because of their passive guidance systems, but because of how easy they are to hide. I mean, Iran's most capable S-300 and Bavar 373 radar-guided long-range surface-to-air missile batteries are huge assets made up of multiple vehicles that broadcast detectable electromagnetic energy out into the sky to identify and track targets. And the United States, of course, has long specialized in the suppression and destruction of enemy air defense operations, tailored specifically to taking out these kinds of high-end threats. But an Iranian Misag-3 manpad is just a 4-foot, 37-pound tube that you could stash inside the doorway of an apartment or your least favorite hut. And even when Billy Bad Guy pulls one out and starts trying to target a low-flying aircraft, well, a manpad doesn't broadcast any detectable signatures like a radar-guided weapon would. And as a result, the first warning a Strike Eagle pilot would have gotten, just as in the case of those Sidewinders, would have been from the infrared spike of the launch, maybe just a second or so before impact. Now, these types of pop-up threats can really only be mitigated by putting troops on the ground who can search for and root out manpads and the like. In a lot of ways, low-flying aircraft require infantry support just like tanks do, because despite all the hate these platforms can project on the battlefield, they are still vulnerable to shoulder-fired missiles in the process. Now, for the most part, the easiest way to avoid being hit by a pop-up manpad is just to fly higher than they can reach, which shouldn't be that hard. Again, these systems tend to top out well below 15,000 feet. But as we saw in videos that surfaced all throughout Operation Epic Fury, American fighters seemed to repeatedly dip well into manpad range during this fight. Now, there could be several reasons a fighter might opt to fly at these lower altitudes in combat, like getting a better angle of observation for onboard sensor pods that might be obscured by cloud cover or dust, or maybe conducting a battle damage assessment on recent strikes with your good old-fashioned Mark I eyeballs. But to be clear, in some footage, it absolutely appears these fighters are flying low to conduct gun runs, which, while cost-effective, seems to me like accepting a bit of unnecessary risk. But again, we don't actually know the circumstances of these engagements to draw any real or actual conclusions about that, and I'm not in the business of second-guessing professional combat pilots from the comfort of my office chair here in Tennessee. I think these men and women probably deserve the benefit of the doubt unless evidence surfaces to the contrary. But as a result of taking these risks, there were other American aircraft struck by short-range missiles while flying at low altitudes during Operation Epic Fury, including an F-35A that managed to stay airborne and make it all the way back to a friendly airstrip, an A-10 Thunderbolt II, and very nearly an F-A-18 Super Hornet that just barely dodged the Strike Eagle's fate. So, broaching that manpad targeting envelope was certainly not isolated to that one Strike Eagle pilot, and may have even been dictated by mission requirements. That's really all to say, again, that while I understand our natural instinct to poke fun at a Strike Eagle driver who got shot down twice faster than most service members can even get a travel voucher reimbursed, there is, again, really no reason for us to believe that the pilot was to blame for either of these incidents, unless they recently made a bunch of wishes on a monkey paw or something. But objectively speaking, it could certainly have been worse. As far as I can tell, being shot down twice in the same conflict puts this pilot in very rare company. So far, I've only been able to identify 2 American pilots who can claim the same since World War II, where records about this sort of thing get murky. And both of those pilots came out of Vietnam. U.S. Air Force Captain Guy Gruters was reportedly shot down in his F-100F Super Sabre off the coast of North Vietnam in November of 1967. He and his co-pilot were rescued under heavy fire, and he returned to service only to be shot down again the next month, where he was captured and held as a prisoner of war for 5 years. Air Force Brigadier General James Robinson Reisner was also shot down twice over Vietnam, while being credited with a pretty impressive 8 air-to-air kills throughout his air combat career. In March of 1965, his F-105 Thunder Chief was struck by Vietnamese ground fire, forcing him to maneuver out over the Gulf of Tonkin, where he ejected about a mile offshore and was rescued quickly thereafter. And less than 6 months later, in August of 1965, Reisner was shot down again while hunting for enemy air defense systems. That time, he too was captured by enemy forces and held as a prisoner of war for 7 years. So, I suppose in comparison to these gentlemen, you could really call our modern Strike Eagle pilot pretty darn lucky for not becoming a POW himself, though I'm not sure how lucky he'd feel after eating 2 missiles over the span of just about 5 weeks. But what about this poor guy's call sign? Granted, it has not been disclosed, but I do think they could be facing the real possibility of a rare call sign change, which would certainly buck the tradition for Air Force pilots, which usually states that once a pilot flies in combat with their call sign, it should stick with them forever. But there are a few rare instances of call signs changing after particularly memorable events, or sometimes just because your fellow pilots demand it. When now retired Lieutenant Colonel Dwayne Carey switched from flying Warthogs to flying Vipers, his new F-16 wingman reportedly said his call sign, Spider, was for a, quote, filthy, dirty A-10 driver. So, as a part of welcoming him to his new unit, they also bestowed upon him a new call sign of Digger, which he'd carry with him even after he transitioned to flying an even faster platform in NASA's space shuttle. The U.S. Navy's first female carrier-based fighter pilot, Kara Hultgreen, also saw her call sign change over time. Initially, she was called Hulk, as a play on her last name and reportedly in reference to her ability to bench press more than 200 pounds, despite her very small frame. But after making several TV appearances, her fellow naval aviators changed her call sign to Revlon, which just goes to show that nobody ever said pilots weren't petty. Hey guys, editing Alex here to interject with some wild hair and important context. I just learned while cutting this video together that Lieutenant Kara Hultgreen was also the first female American fighter pilot ever to die in a crash. She died in 1994 while attempting to land an F-14 Tomcat on an aircraft carrier, and I just thought that was worth including. Rest in peace, Lieutenant Hultgreen. So whatever our poor Strike Eagle pilot's call sign currently is, I do think there's a chance that they're in for a change in title. And I'm personally leaning toward two-timer, or maybe rerun. But I'm very open to suggestions here, so leave them below in the comments. And that'll do it for this edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day, or better yet, download our entirely free new Sandboxx News app that is available on iOS, and it's still not out for Android, but it's coming, I swear, you guys. Not only does the app include all of our incredible written content from subject matter experts like Delta Force legend George Hand and Navy SEAL turned CIA officer Frumentarius, but it also has all of our long and short form videos. And in just about a week or so, the app will also have the long form versions of the interviews that I conduct to make my episodes of Air Power. So if you want to peek behind the scenes at how awkward I really am when I'm interviewing generals and stuff, well, the Sandboxx News app is the place for you. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.